every Sunday afternoon when my sisters and I were little, our parents would pile us in the back seat of the 1961 Plymouth, you know, the one with the tail fins. Ours was white, so you could take a ride. Now, Mom grew up on a farm, so we always would spend part of the ride going past the fields. And nothing pleased her more than following a truck filled with the fresh produce that was going from the farm to the cannery, because invariably something would fall off one of the trucks. And she would send one of us kids running to pick it up and bring it back to the car, and she would munch happily on whatever that fresh produce was. Now, when this first happened, I did worry out loud about stealing. I thought that we should, pick up the stuff, chase after the truck, and return it. After all, if I took something from the store, I'd have to take it back. And that's when Mother explained the concept of gleaning. Gleaning meant farmers intentionally left corners and edges of the field with crops so that those who could not afford their groceries, those who were hungry, could go to the field and pick those extra crops and use them. So for her, produce falling off the truck, well, that was modern day gleaning. She could always come up with an explanation of some sort. Well, gleaning in the days of Ruth and Naomi was Israel's version of social services. The book of Leviticus clearly stated that farmers should not harvest all the way to the corners or all the way to the edges of their fields, because there would be those who could not afford food, those who did not grow their own food, those who were in poverty who would be able to come and harvest that food. Because even if you were poor, the law of Moses was clear that everyone should have enough food. So when Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem, they had only what they could wear and what they could carry. Now, fortunately, they arrived just as the barley harvest was starting. And Ruth told Naomi that she was going to go off and glean in the fields. Naomi suggested that she go to fields owned by Boaz. Boaz was a distant relative of her deceased husband, Elimelech. Isn't that a great name? Elimelech, Elimelech, Elimelech. Aren't you glad you don't live in my head? Naomi knew that Ruth was a foreigner, and she was also a young woman who would be considered absolutely fair game for any of the men who were working in the fields. And so she told her to go to Boaz's field. Now, Boaz immediately noticed the new young woman working with the other women near the edge of his field, and he may have noticed Ruth for a number of reasons. After all, she was new and it was a really small town. There wasn't a whole lot of population turnover in the village of Bethlehem in those days, and most people lived and died in the same village without traveling more than 50 miles from their homes. So any new face was noticeable. Boaz had also heard about Naomi's return to Bethlehem, and no doubt he heard she arrived with a Moabite. Now that was noteworthy because Moab was, an enemy of Israel. And Naomi, returning to Bethlehem with someone from Moab, would be like a soldier today returning home to Two Rivers from Afghanistan, bringing a known terrorist. People were scandalized, and they were ready to treat Ruth like the enemy that they believed that she was. Now, Boaz may have noticed Ruth because, well, let's face it, she was a good-looking young woman. And as an older, successful man who either was single or wealthy enough to be able to support another wife, he may have been attracted to her. After all, as far as we could tell, he had no sons, and he would want an heir at some point, and Ruth might be able to provide that heir. And Boaz may have noticed Ruth because, well, he knew that Naomi's husband had land near Bethlehem to which Naomi still had the title. And as a relative of her husband, Boaz was in line to buy that land. He had not yet talked with Naomi, but he probably figured if he could get in good with Ruth, she might speak a kind word to Boaz so that he would have first dibs at buying that land. Or it could be just as simple as the verses that Sandy just read for us. Boaz knew Naomi was back in town grieving mightily over the deaths of her husband and her sons. And Ruth had come with her to make sure that in the midst of this overwhelming grief, she was cared for. Ruth worked hard and she was honest, so Boaz rewarded her loyalty, her courage, and her work ethic. Now, we don't know exactly why, but for whatever reason, Boaz did the right thing. He knew the teachings of the prophets, and he followed the teachings of the prophets that said to care for the orphan, care for the widow, and care for the stranger, and in those days that meant immigrant in his midst. And like most of us, it's highly likely that Boaz did the right thing for a whole lot of reasons. Probably couldn't pick one out of the bunch. Now here's the thing, most of us learned the story of Ruth in Sunday school, and we learned to think of it as a really nice story, right? I mean, the down-and-out women find a way to persevere, the honorable man steps up and does the right thing for the purest of motives, the bereft mother-in-law finds life through her daughter-in-law, and we can read and enjoy Ruth the same way that we read and enjoy the classic Disney stories. The poor princess gets rescued by Prince Charming and all is well. Now, just as an aside, in the past 20 years, Disney has begun writing stories where strong women are not always evil queens. And in some of the more recent stories, men and women are even seen as equal. It's a good day. But anyway, Ruth is a nice story. And we can keep looking at Ruth as a really nice story, but honestly, Ruth asks so much more from us. Ruth wants to challenge us. Ruth is a story that demands, we think about our response to the prophet's demands, that we care for the orphan, that we care for the widow, that we care for the strangers and the immigrants in our midst. Ruth requires us to ask, who are those people in our midst? Who are the children that we see wandering the streets, who appear not to have homes to which they can go, who appear to be lost, who appear to be losing their way in life? Who are the widows? Who are the lonely? Who are the people who don't have any real visible means of support and could use a little help? Who are the strangers in our midst? Who are those people who appear on the edges of our lives the way Ruth appeared on the edges of Boaz's fields? And what are our motives for helping or not helping those who seem to need help? Why do we offer protection for some and not for others? Why do we insist on traveling into the unknown with some and leaving others to go on their journey by themselves? You see, Ruth wants to be so much more than a nice story. In fact, she demands that we look at our motives, our reasons, and our rationalizations as we respond to need. Ruth demands that we examine our generosity of spirit as well as our attitude to those whom are the strangers in our midst. Ruth demands that we take her seriously. She's not just a nice little story. Ruth is a book that challenges our words, our attitudes, and our actions. Ruth wants us to do the right thing. Now, I suspect we're all a bit like Boaz. When we think about doing the right thing, we have a lot of motives for why we would. A lot of reasons for why we would reach out and care for those kids walking down the street, for why we would care for those who seem to be lost and alone, or those who appear on the edges whom we don't know, who may come from totally other places. We have a lot of motives, but whatever his motives, it's important for us to see that Boaz chose to do the right thing. He made sure that a distant relative and a young woman from a foreign country, and not a foreign country that anyone liked, had enough to eat. He made sure that Ruth was safe while she worked. He made sure that he followed the teachings of the prophets, and we don't really know exactly why. But Boaz did the right thing. But I gotta tell you, bless you, when it comes to our world today, when it comes to the kids who are lost and wandering, when it comes to those who are in need, when it comes to immigrants today, it feels like our world today and this century are incredibly more complicated. We want to do the right thing, but we also want to do the smart thing. We want to do what pleases God, but we also want to do what makes sense economically, what makes sense in terms of our security, what makes sense in terms of our future. Even when we want to do the right thing, we're so often bogged down by the enormity of issues that are involved, those issues that we can see, those issues that other people tell us are real, that are involved when we're trying to do the right thing. And it seems like so often doing the right thing is incredibly complicated. So often we think we know what the right thing is, but how to get it done? And is it the smart thing to do? Is it the thing that's going to guarantee our security? Is it a thing that's going to drive us all broke? What is the right thing? Well, anytime I look at national issues in doing the right thing, and maybe I'm not alone, anytime I look at international issues, I'm not always exactly sure what to do. So perhaps like Boaz, we can not worry so much about the greater picture, but start by asking ourselves, what can we do in our own backyards? What can we do in our own communities? What can we do with the kids we know are in trouble, the kids that we call at risk? What can we do with those people who seem to be so alone, who always seem to need help, and legitimately need help? What can we do about those people who seem to be so very different from we are, might not even speak our own language? What can we do about the least and the lonely and the lost? What can we do right here in Manitowoc? What can we do right here in Two Rivers? What can we do in our county? Because I think if we start looking locally, if we start looking on the edges of our own periphery, is that a word? Good, thank you. On the edges of our own periphery, if we start looking along the edges of our own backyards, we might begin to see some people where it's not so hard to do the right thing. We might be able to see some people where it's not so hard to reach out and offer a helping hand, where it's not so hard to bridge the differences, where it's not so hard to care for the orphan in our midst, the widow, and the stranger. You know, I've always known that Jesus was supposed to make me squirm. I just truly did not expect Ruth was going to make me squirm also. Amen. Amen.